see what happens with it.
Anyway, I will get up here.
It'll be about 10 minutes.
We don't know what they
Cameron's got
Probably need it, but no, it's just a short distance.
Oh, you see the number, let's see.
They told us they were about Sarah.
The wind went
Well, I thought to say, well, who is the Abraham family?
So we do, we get out the car and go in the house.
Good thing your husband's not Abraham.
get out.
I'd be like,
Just
wow,
finish it before- and just leave it like that is, especially if the camera goes out.
To start if I would have known. So I didn't see the worst.
She shouldn't have, but
Yeah.
but she wouldn't be. I know that's the custom back
Did you get rain last night?
Yes.
It nearly hurts.
Well, I heard it some, but I think it.
Back again already?
Yeah, I didn't prep John here real quick.
Yes, it was.
I
Between 9 and 10 when I realized.
Yeah, that's right.
Just in case.
Right, I definitely
Everywhere.
knew about
Well, it's
that.
blackout that I call him though. He doesn't know his name's blackout. He doesn't answer when I say blackout.
I had raised my window a little bit just, and I felt the sill to see if it was raining in, but it was okay.
Just right, really good
Oh,
for your family today.
yes. I don't know if I knew. All I need
I
is
should have called her Dale.
You probably sit on your,
Oh, it's okay. I must sit down. Or John.
Yeah, there you go. He is pretty tall. He stands up on his hind legs.
I'm going to turn the record on now, just so y'all know.
I guess I should go to the right book. I was reading the other day.
Watch what you say.
I have some on my shoulders.
Hi, Isaac.
Did the bell ring yet?
It should have rung.
Darn it. I fixed my brag that I was here early, but
Well,
Yeah, mine goes
you know, if you're here before the bell rings, you're on time.
all right. Well, I didn't hear it ring, so I'm gonna assume I'm on time.
That's exactly right.
It's really bad.
Huh? Nobody.
Roger did.
Well, I haven't seen a deacon in a long time ring that bell. I generally ring it if I'm out there. We are in Genesis, the 16th chapter. We are starting that tonight. We've covered 15 chapters now. Can you think of some of the saddest points in the book of Genesis that we have looked at so far?
Sodom and Gomorrah.
Sodom and Gomorrah, very sad point.
Of course, Abraham was not honest about Sarah being his wife.
Yep, that's a sad point. Yes, Karen?
When God regretted that he had made man.
Very sad point, and so we had the flood. Hi, Debbie. Hi, Pat. Were you winking at me when you came in, Pat? I saw that left eye closed.
Trying to sneak in and you're looking right over there. Right on there if you
Come on, there's another sad point that I know of. Go all the way back, beginning of Genesis.
No, Adam and Eve.
Adam and Eve, very sad point. All right, well,
And killed Abel.
yep, Cain and Abel, sad point. We're going to look at another sad point tonight, Genesis 16, very sad point. I labeled it, go in unto my maid, but in fact what I should have labeled was Sarah's scheme fails, because that's exactly what happened. I don't know of any sick, for sure. I mean, Maxine was here Sunday. Obviously, she is feeling better, but she's not able to get out as often as she'd like. So we want to keep her in our prayers. And other than that, I'm feeling great. My energy level's coming back. Seem like I've got more energy right now than I have in a year. I'm not having the hot flashes that I used to have. And yeah. So let's see, what else is new?
My cane.
Oh, I've lost 12 pounds. Yeah, Gene's carrying a cane now. And you better watch out. If he gets angry, he might use it. Jensen, would you like to lead us in prayer?
Our Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for all your many wonderful blessings and this beautiful day you've given us to be able to gather here this evening to study another portion of your word. Please be with us as we go through this study that we learn how to apply it in our lives to become better servants for you. And forgive us of our sins and repent of them. In Christ's name we pray.
Amen. All right, if you have your handout, you're on page 37. And I use the same title that he used, that SQ used, Go In Unto My Maid. He gave A, B, and C 3 different titles of Genesis 16. He used Genesis 16 verse 2 as the key verse to this chapter. And then he's got the outline, and then we'll look at lessons of Genesis. I didn't use everything he has here, so this is why I gave this outline to you, so you can study ahead and study a few things that we don't look at here, because the goal is to try to get through one chapter a week. Sometimes we don't always make that, but we try to. Otherwise, we might be on Genesis for 3 or 4 years. And that's not a bad thing. We're not in a hurry. Because when Jesus comes again, he's going to come again. And our goal is to know as much as possible and to do as much as possible for him. But here's the interesting thing about Genesis chapter 16. Because in this account, the story shifts its point of view so that each of the women involved is the focal point of half of this chapter. Sarai is the first half of the chapter, and Hagar will be the last half of the chapter. And in both cases, the women are distraught over their position in the household. Sarai is embarrassed by her barrenness, and Hagar faces the life of an outcast. So let's look at this. Beginning in verse 1, says, Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, and she had an Egyptian maidservant whose name was Hagar. All right, so we look at that first verse there. This is the first time we read of a slave being given to a husband as a second wife. Hagar was mostly likely obtained from their Egyptian sojourn back in chapter 12 and verse 16. You remember the Pharaoh gave Abram a number of servants and everything, and a number of livestock, and sent them away. And that's what verse 1 says, that she's an Egyptian maidservant, okay? Yes, Mary?
You said second wife. It was common for them to have concubines.
Yes, and we'll talk about that. But your point is well taken. I didn't mean to jump ahead of you. If you have,
That's okay.
okay, you have more to say on it though?
No.
Okay. Hagar belongs to Sarai as property, and the ensuing complications of their relationship build on that fundamental fact. Okay, that Hagar is under Sarai's control is emphasized in the following story. Hello, John. It's emphasized in the following story by personal adjectives. You'll see my maid, her maid. Abraham says her maid. Sarai says my maid. Sarai gives Hagar to Abram, and even afterwards Abram states, as the maid is under your authority. Look at verse 2, where he says, So Sarai said to Abram, See now the Lord has restrained me from bearing children. Please go into my maid. Perhaps I shall obtain children by her. And Abram heeded the voice of Sarai. Now look at verse 3. Then Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, her maid, the Egyptian, and gave her to her husband Abram to be his wife, after Abram had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan. Now go down to verse 6. So Abram said to Sarai, Indeed your maid is in your hand. Do to her as you please. And when Sarai dealt harshly with her, she fled from her presence. So you see, Sarai gives Hagar to Abram. But Abram states, as the maid is under your authority. And we see that in these verses. Any comments on verse 1?
The point of irritation you see very quickly, Sarah was barren.
Yes,
Hagar was not.
that's correct. And-
there was a basic point of irritation.
Yes. And we're going to see that in this chapter, but as Gene's mentioned a couple of times, Ishmael is the son that will be born here to Hagar. And all Ishmaelites are a mix of Hebrews and the Egyptians, okay? Because you have Abraham, Hebrew, and you have Hagar, an Egyptian, all right? So, we look at Genesis chapter 2, and chapter 16, verse 2. Sarai, or Sarah, whichever you want to call her, at this point she's still Sarai, but she will become Sarah, formed her own plans whereby she could have children instead of consulting the Lord about the situation. And this is one of the major problems here. They forgot about God. Sarah did. Not so much Abraham, but maybe to a little bit Abraham too. Because it was a serious matter for a man to be childless in the ancient world. For it left him without an heir. You remember Lot was supposedly an heir. And of course they parted ways. But it was even more terrible in this case for a woman to be childless. Because to have a great brood of children was a mark of success as a wife. To have none was a major failure. And this is the way Sarah was looking at herself at this point. So notice how impersonal all of this is. Sarah never speaks directly to Hagar or speaks her name. Hagar is a tool to relieve Sarah's embarrassment. Yet Sarah never claims Ishmael as her son. And you're going to see that throughout this chapter. Any thoughts through verse 2?
Well, I mean, you said, and maybe some Abraham.
Yes.
Well, there's no maybe about it. He's the one that was in the act with Hagar, so he made a choice of being there with Hagar himself.
Sure.
I mean, there's no maybe to that question.
All right, so as I have up on the screen here, this is the first time that we read of a slave being given to a husband as a second wife. You remember Sarah said, I'm giving Hagar to you to be your wife. Okay? So, the word used is not the word for concubine, and modern translations that render it such miss the point of the narrative here. The literary point made. God still sees a distinction between the two women and their place in the family. It is also interesting that although she is called a wife here, Genesis 25 verse 6, turn over there to Genesis 25 verse 6, and Donna, I'll let you read that first. Here it uses the standard Hebrew word for concubine when speaking of her and Keturah, who is also initially called a wife. Read Genesis 25 verse 6 first.
But to the sons of his concubines Abraham gave gifts while he was still living, and sent them away from his son Isaac eastward to the land of the east.
Okay, so she's called a concubine here. Keturah is also included in that, but she was initially called a wife as well. Look at Genesis 25 verse 1. Karen, you have that?
Yes. And Abraham took another wife, and her name was Keturah.
So, what a reversal of roles we find here. Just as Abraham gave Sarah to Pharaoh, now Sarah gives Hagar to Abram. Although this was an acceptable practice in their custom, it is obvious that the negative consequences far outweighed the positives. Further, it clearly falls outside God's ideal for marriage, which was taught from the very beginning. You go back to Genesis chapter 2 and chapter 3. It was Sarah's idea, but Abram listened to her, and that's what Debbie was bringing out here. Abram listened to her. Hagar apparently did not protest. So now we got three people involved in this.
Would she have had a choice?
She would have had a choice.
Hagar would have had
Well, she was a servant, But keep in mind, servants back during that day were not like the slaves that we know of today. The slaves we know of today had no choice. I mean, if they got out of line just a little bit, they were going to be whipped. But the servants or slaves back during that day was given responsibility. Don't know if Hagar had any responsibility or not. And she may not have had a choice. But she apparently was high enough in Sarah's order of servants that Sarah thought highly enough of her to give her to Abraham as his wife, okay? But then she lost total respect for her.
What about the children? I mean, if a maidservant had a child, does the child become the master's? I mean, in those days. Yeah, I mean, did that work like that? I mean, so why would Sarah, in other words, why would Sarah think that would be a child? She gave her husband.
Abraham's seed.
Yeah, okay.
Her goal was, because she was childless,
Yeah.
Abraham needed an heir. This was to be an heir, okay? But that was not God's goal. And so neither one of them had consulted God on this matter. You remember, God told Abraham that there would be a child from his seed. He didn't say it's coming from Sarah because he hadn't revealed that much yet. And Abraham didn't take time to ask, well, okay, is this child going to come from Sarah, or am I going to have a child with some other woman? They just totally left God out of this at this point. John.
Where do you get Genesis 25:6 is referring to Hagar?
If you read the whole chapter and everything, Hagar is mentioned there.
Okay, she ain't mentioned up until the 6th.
No, but it says concubines, and Hagar was one of his wives. And so she became a concubine.
So was the, whatever her name
Keturah.
was. Keturah.
But I went back to Genesis 25:1 where it said she was his wife.
And she had about 7 or 8 kids.
Yes, she
And
did.
then it's talking about he gave all of his possessions to Isaac, not to any of them.
Right.
But Keturah was after Sarah died, right?
Yes.
Do what?
Keturah was after Sarah died.
Yes. So, yeah, and we'll get to that, John, and you're right. He gave it all to Isaac and not to those. But Isaac was the chosen child.
Now, Isaac was identified as the son of promise.
He was the son of promise that God had promised. And Abram began to realize that at some point. And we'll get to that as we get a little further into Genesis. So,
But the eldest son got everything, and they didn't.
yes. Which means that Ishmael, technically, by the laws there, should have been given everything. Now, Abraham did take care of him. Okay? And we'll see that. But the point is, in chapter 16 here, we got a big problem here. We got a couple of women here that's not very happy. Because it is obvious that the negative consequences far outweigh the positives here. And it clearly falls outside of God's ideal for marriage, as we mentioned. So who was ultimately at fault?
Both of them.
It would seem that most likely that everyone holds a little of the responsibility. Everyone. The primary problem with Sarah's idea is that it involved the employment of human devices, seemingly to bolster up a divine purpose. Her complaint condemns her for seizing the initiative from God's hands. Now, looking at some of the commentators, here's what I found, because many commentators note how closely this passage parallels the fall. The sequence, the passage I'm talking about is verses 2 and 3 here, okay? The sequence of events is similar in both cases. The woman takes something and gives it to her husband. Sarah gives Hagar to her husband, who Abraham accepted it. What's more significant is that it seems to indicate the author's perception of this act. By employing similar formulations and an identical sequence of events in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 6. Let's go back and look at Genesis chapter 3 and verse 6, and then we'll go to Genesis chapter 16 and verses 3 and 4. Mary, do you have Genesis chapter 3 verse 6?
Verses 3 and 4.
No, Genesis 3 verse 6.
Oh, Genesis 3. Verse
Yes, please.
Man, weeks, man.
When the woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good for food and pleasing to the eye and also desirable for gaining wisdom, she took some and ate it. She also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate it.
Okay. So you see kind of a parallel there. Sarah's given Hagar to Abraham, and he took it. Eve gave the fruit to Adam, and he took it. Now look at Genesis chapter 16 and verses 3 and 4. Pat, you had that?
So Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years. Sarai and his wife took her Egyptian maidservant Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. That doesn't.
Yeah. Go on.
He slept with Hagar and she conceived. And when she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress.
Okay. You see the similarity between 3 and 6 and 16 and 3 and 4? The author makes it clear that for both narratives describe a comparable events, okay? Any comments?
Well, I was thinking of Hannah. She was made fun of because she didn't bear any children. And, of course, the Lord heard her prayer and gave her children.
Yeah. And, of course, when we get a little further, we're going to talk about the fact that Sarah laughed whenever she was told that she would bear a child. Abraham laughed also. We're going to talk about that a little bit. And
chastised, but Abraham wasn't.
all right, so when God's plans are not followed, problems often ensue. One problem that can develop involves strained relationships. Look again at verse 4. So he went in to Hagar, and she conceived, and when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress, Sarah, came despised, or her mistress became despised in her eyes. Okay? So, what do we have here?
Point of irritation.
Do what?
Point of irritation.
Yep. After the plan was successful and Hagar conceived, now we begin to see the evil results beginning. This passage is also translated, became dishonorable in her eyes, is one way of putting it, or lightly esteemed in her eyes. The idea is that Hagar felt a boastful feeling, perhaps to the point of looking down on Sarah. Okay? Think about that for a minute. I had a child. You can't bear any children. So perhaps she felt that her pregnancy exalted her to a position now ahead of Sarah in the familial pecking order. Because she supposedly has the heir to the throne, if you want to speak of it that way. So we look at Genesis chapter 16 and verse 5, where it says, Then Sarah said to Abram, My wrong be upon you. I gave my maid into your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, I became despised in her eyes. The Lord judge between you and me. So the idea is when our plans backfire, we often try to lay the blame on others. Sarah's anger leads to impaired judgment here. And further, Hagar's wrong leads Sarah to do further wrong. First, Sarah blames everything on Abram. Well, I can relate to that. Most husbands can. Oh.
I knew this was building up to this.
Okay. Sarah's anger, she blames everything on Abram, although we got to keep in mind it was initially her idea. Then after casting the blame on Abram, she admits to her part while still blaming him. Then after casting, it is amazing. What is amazing was someone led by emotions and wounded pride will say, "The Lord judge between you and me." Notice again there, verse 5, where it says, "I became despised in her eyes, the Lord judge between you and me." Notice that.
Well, we still got to go back to my point before. You keep saying she's blaming him. Well, she's got a point to blame him too, because he still went into the act of, and so even though she provoked it, he still did it.
He could have said no, thank you.
Yes.
He could have.
So, you're saying that she's blaming it on the guy. Well, the guy had some responsibility here too.
Well, yeah, I've already said that everybody's to blame.
I think that's what this verse is saying.
Take two.
This
Yeah.
is where she's
In that
saying,
case, three.
God judge between you and me. We were both wrong.
Yeah.
Both
Yeah,
of us
that's
are
what-
wrong. She's saying
let
God
the Lord see
judge
who's the
between
worst.
you and me. Because we're both guilty.
And the reason you see that is the same ancient legal codes that allowed surrogate marriages offered protection to the first wife. Okay? Apparently, though, Abram had not protected Sarah. He allowed this situation to develop. If Abram will not offer the legal protection to which Sarah, is entitled, Sarah hopes confidently that the Lord will. And that's why you see that statement, "The Lord's judge between you and me." Okay? Any comments through verse 5?
I'm going to have a little conversation with you here.
Go ahead. Ron will answer it.
I'm a little confused because, back in those days, even now, women, want to have children. And she believed in the promise that was given about Abraham's seed, right? So I understand looking at it from these many years back. I can look back and see that it wasn't God's plan. But how did Sarah know? Like, if she wasn't told, because her first statement is, "The Lord found it that I would be unbearing." How did she know she wasn't doing the right thing? If it was an acceptable act to give your maidservant, or even him having concubines, then how did she know at that point when that happened that it was the wrong thing? So that's a
Well,
conversation.
Your question's a good question. Yes, John.
Up to this time, had Sarah been included into the promise? I know she is after this, that the Abraham's seed will come from Sarah. But up until this time, is it just Abraham's seed?
Yes.
Yeah.
And that's the problem. Sarah, God never said to Abraham that the seed is going to come from Sarah. He said the seed will come, that you will have a seed, a promised seed, okay? He never said it was going to come from Sarah. Sarah's age is advancing now, too. Remember, Abraham and Sarah's age is both advancing. She's childless. And in her mind, though, according to ancient customs and everything, Abram needs an heir. Okay? She wants to give him that heir. Where the fault lies, though, beginning with Sarah and Abram, is they both left God out of the scheme. They did not go to God in prayer and ask for divine guidance. And so Sarah's taking everything, she's taking control. I could get in trouble again, but I'm not going to. She's taking control, and she's basically put herself in the authoritative scheme of the whole process. And Abram, not accepting, how do I want to say it? Maybe he lost a little bit of faith here, maybe. He allowed Sarah, just as Adam allowed Eve, to cause him to do wrong, but it's his fault. Because he didn't continue to be the head of the household here. I'll put it that way. Stephanie?
I wouldn't say they cost him. I mean, if I make a cake and I set it out, I'm not telling you to eat it. I'm not forcing you to eat it. It's up to you. I can offer it. It's up to you.
Oh, but if my wife made a cake and she said, honey, this cake is for you, you think I'm going to tell her that I'm not going to eat a piece of that cake?
Yes.
But of course, she tempted him to do wrong instead of wrong.
We're kind of going in a
She
little
put the
bit different.
temptation in front of him. and
Just like Eve,
Something
with
like
the
I'm on a
apple,
diet, you know, you're not
yes,
supposed
it's
to do
good.
stuff
Just
like
like Eve did with the apple.
Yeah.
She put it in front of him and he
And he took it.
You also
And let's
found,
face it, that's
She
a
didn't make him
right.
take a lot.
you
All right.
found too that Adam,
He went on it.
Adam
He
blamed
just did it. He
God.
was weak. She wanted fruit.
For-
Adam blamed God, said, this woman you gave me.
He said, the woman you gave me, she gave this to me.
Eve also blamed God, and the serpent blamed God.
But see, the only difference is that Eve did know that it was wrong. So, would you think that Sarah knew what she was doing was wrong when she was doing it?
I think she didn't trust in God enough at this point.
Right.
Maybe
So
she
there's
said,
still
Go ahead, Gene.
similarities there.
Gene, you had a continued thought?
I said, he said, did Sarah know that she was doing wrong when she didn't? I said, Sarah didn't do anything.
Well, she gave Hagar.
She's an innocent victim.
Sarah, innocent victim?
Well, yeah, she was the one that was barren. She was the wife. And it was Hagar that had the child.
But it was Sarah that gave Hagar to Abram.
yeah, they gave the permission.
It was her one baked the cake.
And then, here's where the problem lies, Gene. When Sarah gave Hagar to Abram and Hagar produced a child, Sarah never claimed that child as her own, and she despised Hagar for what she did. So Sarah was wrong from the very beginning in the approach that she took. That's where she is wrong.
Are you saying if she'd have claimed the child, she'd have been right?
No, I said she was wrong from the
But
very...
you kept saying she's never claimed the child.
She didn't.
No, she didn't. But if she had it, she would have been right.
I didn't say that.
No.
Don't put words in my mouth now, John. John, don't put words in my mouth.
It wasn't said, it was implied.
No, it wasn't. No, it wasn't. All right, let's go to verse 6.
I understand where he's coming from, because you kind of put it along.
Yeah, but John always does this to me, you know. Let's go to verse 6. Debbie, read verse 6 for me.
Wait, every time. Where am I at? 16?
16:6, yes.
Okay. I'm still involved in that conversation.
You know, evidently Hagar was not submissive after she had the child.
Yes.
And she became pregnant. So she was difficult to get along with, and that caused a problem.
Well, sure, because, hey, I had a child and you didn't.
Right.
She expected to be elevated in
So
this.
it's not all on Sarah.
No, it's on all three of them. Well,
I say, no, do it.
here. We do it like this. Poor pie, you know. But they each get a third.
That's not a third.
Okay. They each get a third.
There you go.
We're gonna assume that's a third.
Debbie, read verse 6 for me before I get in trouble here.
So Abram said to Sarai, indeed your maid is in your hand. Do to her as you please. And when Sarai dealt harshly with her, she fled from her presence.
All right, on your handout is page 38, capital letter F. In conflicts, the least guilty can sometimes receive the most severe consequences. Okay? So, the text does not say here that Sarai did something that was unjustifiable. Further, Hagar had done wrong and required correction. Perhaps, it didn't say that either, okay? Perhaps Sarai proceeded to offer some corrective discipline, such as a demotion to living with other servants, maybe performing menial tasks. These have been suggested by some of the commentators, which did not sit well with Hagar at this point. She's got a child. Sarah doesn't. There could have been some physical abuse here too. Don't know that. We would be suspicious. Do what?
Presumptive.
Yeah, we'd be presumptive if we tried to say that. But there are some commentators that would suggest that. Okay? Here's the thing. Whatever the case, Hagar refused the correction and she fled. Thus, instead of securing the fulfillment of their wishes, Sarah and Abraham had reaped nothing but grief and vexation, and apparently had lost the maid through their self-concerted scheme. Yes, John?
Does any of the commentaries say anything about Sarah could have took the child and run Hagar off?
Well, yeah, but those are way out commentaries.
Well, that seems like the idea to start with.
Yeah, it could have been. All right, look
Being
at
a child by Hagar.
look at verse 7. Stephanie, read verse 7 for me, please.
Now the angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, by the spring on the way to Shur in.
All right, so here's the first mention of the angel of the Lord in the Bible. Okay, this is not part of your handout. This is something I, through a little research, had put in there. Okay, he is not to be understood as just any angel of God, though, but is a specific messenger who portrays God and often speaks as God Himself. There is the thought that this is Jesus Christ here, this angel of the Lord, okay? Hagar understood this to be God Himself, even if only in the message. Look at verse 13 of Genesis 16, where it says, "Then she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, 'You are the God who sees,' for she said, 'Have I also here seen Him who sees me?'" Okay? So, the exact location of Shur is unknown, though most place it somewhere on the outskirts of Egypt, somewhere between Egypt and Palestine. Now, I don't have a map of that, I'm sorry. But Shur means wall in Hebrew. And scholars have linked the name with the line of fortifications the Egyptians built on their northern border. Okay? Any comments through verse 7?
It says the angel of the Lord.
Yes.
I mean, like, not a angel
Right.
of the Lord, so
Right.
it has to be some significance to the.
That's what I say. The thought is that it was Jesus Christ Himself. Okay?
Angel is capitalized in mine.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah. All right. So, look at verses 8 and 9. Let's see, whose turn is it to read? Jensen, read verses 8 and 9 for me.
And he said, Hagar, Sarah's maid, where have you come from, and where are you going? She said, I am fleeing from the presence of my mistress Sarai. The angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress, and submit yourself under her hand.
All right. So again, now this is not in your handout. This is things that I added as I studied this, okay? The angel of God first points out Hagar's rightful place. He says, your sir's servant. Okay? Hagar recognizes and admits that her position remains. Therefore, she must correct the wrong in her life and resume her proper position of servitude to Sarai. Is there any place in the New Testament where we see something similar?
Onesimus.
Huh?
Onesimus.
Yes. What was Onesimus told to do?
That's his master.
And what was his master told to do? Accept him. Accept him. Okay. All right. So that's verses 8 and 9. Now look at verses 10 through 12. Let's see, John.
And the angel of the Lord said unto her, I will multiply thy seed exceedingly, and that it shall not be numbered for multitude. And the angel of the Lord said unto her, Behold, thou art with child, and shall bear a son, and shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord hath heard thy affliction, and he will be a wild man, and his hand will be against every man, and every man's hand against him, and he shall dwell in the presence of all his brethren.
Okay. See anything similar? Any similarity there to what's going on today?
Does this relate to Esau? So
Esau?
it sounds like Esau and his descendants.
Well, yeah, we'll talk about Esau and his descendants a little bit later on. Your question's a good question there. But hold that question. If I don't get to it a little bit later, then I'll come back to it, okay?
Well, most of these people out here that's doing all this stuff claims that Ishmael is the chosen one.
Right, right. And what's that verse say? His hand shall be against every man, and every man's hand against him, and he shall dwell in the presence of all his brethren. You see something similar? Okay, so here's the thing. This is capital letter G in your handout, the prophecy concerning Ishmael and his descendants. God's blessing of nations to Abram finds its first fulfillment through Hagar and Ishmael. Hagar already knows she is pregnant, and the novel information given to her now is that she is carrying a male, and his name will be Ishmael, which means God hears. Okay? This will be a constant reminder of this occasion when God spoke with Hagar and reassured her. He goes on, though, to say he shall be a wild man. In verse 12, at the beginning of it. The Hebrew word is a wild ass man, i.e., a man like a wild donkey. Fierce and untamed and unsettled in his habitation, or as that creature is. Look at Job 39 verses 5 and 8, Isaac.
Who set the wild donkey free? Who loosed the bonds of the hunger? 2:8 or just 5?
Yeah, through 8. 5 through 8.
Whose home had made the wilderness, and the barren land his dwelling? His scorn the tumult of the city, he does not heed the shouts of the driver. The range of the mountains is his pasture, and he searches after every green thing.
And then we can also look at Jeremiah, the 2nd chapter, in verse 24. Ron, you have that?
A wild donkey used to the wilderness that sniffs at the wind in her desire, in her time of mating, who can turn her away? All those who seek her will not worry themselves. In her month they will find her.
Okay, and then Donna, look at, let's see, where am I? Yeah, Donna. Hosea chapter 8, verse 9.
For they have gone up to Assyria like a wild donkey all alone. Ephraim has hired lovers.
So, living in deserts is what is prophesied for Ishmael, and mountains. He will be warlike. His descendants will be warlike. They will be violent, exercising himself continually in hunting beasts and oppressing men. Go to Genesis 21st chapter and look at verse 20. Karen, you had that?
Yes. And God was with the lad, and he grew, and he dwelt in the wilderness, and became, as he grew up, an archer.
Okay. He will provoke and injure all that converse with him, and thereby will multiply his enemies, which is to be understood not only of him, but also of his posterity. This was the prophecy, if you will, concerning Ishmael and his descendants. Any comments through verse 12? All right, Karen, read verses 13 and 14 for me, if you will.
And she called the name of Jehovah that spake unto her, Thou art a God that seeketh. For she said, Have I even here looked after him that seeth me? Wherefore the well was called Bera Laha Roa. Behold, it is between Kadesh and Bera.
Okay, so as I have up here, Hagar acknowledged God's providential care and named the well Bir Leha Roy, which means the well of the living one who sees me. Okay, This is the only recorded instance of a person giving a name to God. Hagar gives God a name that expresses His special significance to her. She, Hagar, no longer gloats that she is pregnant, but marvels at the Lord's care for her. Her question as to seeing God can be interpreted in one of two ways. Either she was surprised that she saw Him and remained alive, or was surprised that He would appear to her at all. A dedication, well, let's see. The well, which I said, a well to the living one who sees me, two things seem to be implied here, and then we'll close. First, a dedication of the well to Him who had appeared to her. And secondly, faith in the promise, for He who is the living one existed in all generations, must have it ever in His power to accomplish promises which are to be fulfilled through the whole lapse of time.
You know, I think this tells us that Hagar learned about God, perhaps living there in Abraham's house.
There's no doubt that all the servants in Abraham's house certainly learned about God. And here's a case where God appeared to her, and she saw, maybe for the first time, that God cares for her too. So we'll continue. We'll finish the last two verses on this next week, and then we'll get into chapter 17.